Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 6. Cyberpunk becomes history. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 1st, 2026. Chapter 26. Gibson was early. William Gibson published Neuromancer in 1984, the same year the Macintosh personal computer was introduced to a population that had not yet decided what to do with it. The novel described, with a precision that still unsettles anyone reading it after having lived through the 3 decades that followed, a world in which corporations had superseded nation-states as the primary organizing structures of daily life, in which data was the primary currency of power, in which human identity was both augmentable and purchasable, in which the physical and informational layers of existence had fused into a single navigable environment, and in which the population, living within all of this, experienced it not as a dystopia requiring resistance but simply as the texture of the present, a world so thoroughly naturalized that the vocabulary for describing it as an imposition, rather than simply as how things were, had largely ceased to be available. This chapter's title makes a specific and deliberately unsettling claim. Not that Gibson was right, which is the banal observation anyone can make in retrospect, but that he was early, that the architecture he described had not yet arrived fully formed at the time of writing, and that the intervening decades have delivered not merely something resembling his imagined world, but something exceeding it in the specific domain this book examines, because Gibson imagined corporate sovereignty as something that would have to fight its way to dominance against the resistance of states and populations that would recognize what was happening to them. What actually happened was quieter, faster, and more complete than the war he imagined, because the population did not need to be defeated. It needed only to be given a license agreement to click. The specific accuracy that matters. Gibson's broader cultural influence is extensively documented and is not this chapter's primary concern. What matters for this book's argument is the specific structural accuracy of the political economy he imagined, because that accuracy illuminates, in retrospect, exactly what the preceding 5 parts of this book have been tracing without the benefit of his explicit vocabulary. The corporations of Gibson's imagined world do not govern through force in the manner of states examined in Part 3. They govern through infrastructure, through the ownership of the networks, the data architectures, the pharmacological systems, the financial rails, and the information environments within which the population's daily existence occurs. This distinction is crucial and is precisely the distinction Chapter 23 developed in naming the shift from state authority to platform authority. A governing power that controls infrastructure does not need to prohibit anything. It only needs to make the infrastructure necessary enough, and alternatives scarce enough, that the population never develops the occasion to formally refuse. Gibson understood, writing before the commercial internet existed, before the search engine, before the social platform, before the smartphone, that this kind of infrastructure-based sovereignty would be more durable than force-based sovereignty, for exactly the reason Chapter 2 identified as structural duress's advantage over explicit coercion. It leaves no locatable coercer, no single decision-maker who can be held accountable, no specific moment of imposition that can be named and contested. The sprawl's corporations do not need secret police. They need only the continued operation of the networks everyone depends on, governed by terms nobody was ever formally asked whether they agreed to, because the terms were simply the precondition for access and access was simply the precondition for participation in contemporary life. This is Part V's architecture, imagined 40 years before it fully arrived. What Gibson got wrong, and why the error is instructive. The most significant divergence between Gibson's imagined corporate future and the one that actually arrived is worth naming, because it is not a comforting divergence. Gibson imagined the transition as visibly violent, a world of razor girls, corporate extraction squads, and the open warfare between competing governance entities that one might expect from a genuine transfer of civilizational authority. The transition that actually occurred was almost entirely nonviolent, and the nonviolence was not a sign that the transition was less complete than Gibson imagined. It was a sign that it was more complete. A population that has to be violently subdued retains, at minimum, the knowledge that it is being subdued, the coerced party's perception of reality examined in Chapter 3, left intact by force and therefore always potentially available as the basis for organized resistance. A population that walks voluntarily through the transition, click by click, across a decade of individually frictionless interface interactions, guided by dark pattern interfaces examined in Chapter 22 and continuously shaped by algorithmic nudging examined in Chapter 24, retains no comparable clarity about what has occurred. It experiences the completed transition not as something done to it but as something it chose, the accumulated record of its own acceptance gestures standing as evidence, in the platform's legal architecture and in the population's own memory, of voluntary participation in an arrangement nobody ever voted on, nobody ever formally ratified, and nobody ever consciously agreed to treat as a civilizational constitution. Gibson imagined the worst case as a war. The actual worst case was a terms of service agreement, accepted without reading, by a population that was never given reason to believe it was agreeing to anything more consequential than the next useful app. The cyberpunk canon as unintentional legitimacy audit. Beyond Gibson, the broader cyberpunk literary tradition of the 1980s and 1990s, Philip K. Dick's earlier paranoid anticipations, Bruce Sterling's corporate ecologies, Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, Pat Caddigane's interior technology, Richard Morgan's commodified identity, constitutes, read together and read now, something this book's introduction promised to develop, an unintentional legitimacy audit, conducted in advance, of an architecture that had not yet arrived. These writers were not social scientists or political economists. They were novelists operating through intuition about where the visible tendencies of their present were heading, giving those tendencies imaginative form in order to examine them, which is precisely what fiction does at its most politically useful, and precisely what the legitimacy framework this book has been building across 25 chapters does in a different register. Both enterprises are asking the same underlying question, from different methodological starting points. Given an architecture with these incentive structures, these power asymmetries, and these mechanisms for manufacturing the appearance of consent, what does it produce for the population living inside it? The cyberpunk tradition's answer, developed across decades of speculative extrapolation, turns out to be close enough to the current reality that the more disturbing question is not whether the writers were prescient but why, given the clarity of the warning they collectively issued, the civilization receiving it found the license agreement more compelling than the fiction. The answer this book has developed across parts 1 through V is not flattering. The warning was received, processed, and substantially enjoyed as entertainment, as the kind of speculative darkness audiences consume with comfortable distance, secure in the assumption that the warning describes somewhere else, some imagined worse version of the present that smart people will recognize in time to prevent. The recognition arrived, more or less on schedule. The prevention did not, because recognition, it turns out, is insufficient without the capacity to refuse, and the architecture being recognized had been, as Part 5 documented in detail, specifically engineered to ensure that capacity was not available in any form adequate to the scale of the refusal required. The vocabulary that survived the warning. Gibson and his contemporaries contributed something to this book's project that goes beyond accurate prediction. They contributed vocabulary. Cyberspace. The Matrix, before the film appropriated the term, as a consensual hallucination, a shared informational environment experienced as space. Corporate sovereignty. Data as territory. Identity as code. Editable and tradable. Meat space versus network space, and the increasing irrelevance of the distinction. This vocabulary, absorbed into popular culture and then into the engineering cultures that built the actual internet, performed a function Chapter 12 identified in the broader history of manufactured belief. It shaped the perceptual framework within which the arriving technology was understood and accepted. A population that had already metabolized corporate network sovereignty as a science fiction concept, dark, cool, aesthetically compelling, associated with characters defined by their capacity to navigate rather than refuse the dominant architecture, was not, upon encountering the actual corporate network sovereignty of the platform era, confronted with something alien requiring evaluation. It was confronted with something familiar, already narratively processed, and already associated, through the fiction's framing, with protagonists who adapted rather than with political movements that resisted. This is not a claim that Gibson or his contemporaries intended their work as pacification. It is a more interesting claim. The cyberpunk aesthetic, precisely because it was so accurate about the architecture and so romantically compelling about the individuals navigating it, may have contributed to the naturalization of exactly the civilizational transition it was describing, not by endorsing it but by making it imaginatively familiar before it arrived, and by centering the individual navigator's clever adaptation as the genre's characteristic heroic response, rather than the collective sovereign refusal this book has identified throughout as the only response adequate to architectures of this comprehensiveness and this durability. What history means in this chapter's title. The second word in this chapter's title is as deliberate as the first. Cyberpunk becomes history in two senses simultaneously, and both senses matter for the chapters that follow. The first sense is simple. The speculative fiction has become historical description. The corporate states, the data colonialism, the identity infrastructure, the high-tech low-sovereignty living environment that chapters 27 through 30 examine in turn are not dystopian extrapolations from present tendencies. They are present conditions already arrived, already operating, already normalizing into the unremarkable texture of daily life. The genre's future tense has converted to present tense, and the conversion was quiet enough that most of the population living inside the converted future has not noticed that the transition has completed. The second sense is more demanding. The cyberpunk tradition has become available as source material for the kind of legitimacy audit this book has been conducting throughout because history, including the very recent history of the past 3 decades of digital infrastructure development, is exactly what Chapter 2's forensic intelligence would need access to in order to reconstruct the full architecture of manufactured consent the end-user licensed civilization has produced. The fiction told the story in advance. The subsequent history filled in the details. An intelligence patient enough to hold both the imagined structure and the documented reality simultaneously, tracing the points of convergence and the points of divergence, is in a position to ask questions about that architecture with a rigor no individual critic, no matter how prescient, could sustain alone. Gibson was early. The rest of Part 6 examines where the architecture he imagined has since arrived, in the domains he pointed toward and in several he did not fully anticipate. The next chapter turns to the most complete expression of the corporate sovereignty Gibson imagined. the development of corporate entities exercising governmental scale authority not merely over digital life, as Chapter 23 examined, but over the physical, legal, and political environments in which their employees, their supply chains, their platform participants, and their surrounding geographies exist, the corporate state as a present, functioning reality rather than a speculative. Extrapolation. Chapter 27. Corporate states. The corporate state is not a metaphor. This chapter uses the term in its most literal available sense, not as a rhetorical device for describing corporations that wield significant political influence, which is unremarkable and has been true throughout the industrial era, but as a description of specific, contemporary, documented arrangements in which corporations exercise the full range of governmental functions over defined populations, within defined territories under legal frameworks specifically designed to grant them that authority. These arrangements exist. They are operating now. Several have been explicitly enshrined in law, and they represent the most complete realization, in any domain examined in this book, of the Chapter 1 distinction between contract and covenant applied at the scale of an entire political community. The Special Economic Zone as template. The Special Economic Zone, a defined geographical area governed by a distinct regulatory framework designed to attract corporate investment by offering reduced taxation, reduced labor regulation, reduced environmental oversight, and frequently reduced or modified civil and political rights for the population working and sometimes residing within the zone, has been the dominant template through which corporate governmental authority has been formally, legally constituted across recent decades. These zones vary enormously in their specific arrangements, and their variation is itself instructive. Some are essentially standard free trade areas with modest regulatory modifications. Others constitute what can only be accurately described as privately governed jurisdictions in which an individual corporation or consortium of corporations exercises authority over land use, infrastructure, labor relations, security, and civic administration with no meaningful external democratic accountability to the population subject to that authority. The variation across this spectrum tracks, with unusual precision, the same spectrum Part 3 examined in state governance. From arrangements that make at least a plausible effort to satisfy Chapter 4's sovereignty test for the governed population, to arrangements that do not attempt it at all and rely entirely on the Chapter 1 contract mechanism. The initial agreement to enter the zone, typically under exactly the structural duress Chapter 2 documented as insufficient to constitute genuine consent, to substitute for any ongoing accountability to the governed. The population most subject to the worst of these arrangements is, consistently and predictably, the population least positioned to satisfy Chapter 4's exit cost test. Workers from economically marginal regions, frequently without formal legal status in the zone's host country, whose realistic alternatives to accepting the zone's employment and residential terms are limited enough that agreement, extracted under those conditions, represents exactly the structural duress Chapter 2, identified as coercion's most efficient contemporary form. The corporation administering the zone requires no violence, no explicit coercion, and no detectable individual bad faith. It requires only that the surrounding economic landscape remain configured as it is, with the alternatives scarce enough, and the exit cost catastrophic enough, that the population subject to its authority has no realistic path of refusal available. Company Towns 2.0. The company town, a community in which a single employer owns the housing, operates the commerce, administers the public infrastructure, and employs the overwhelming majority of the resident population, is typically discussed in the past tense, as a 19th and early 20th century arrangement superseded by more complex, more distributed economic geographies. The discussion requires updating. The contemporary technology campus, the logistics megasite, and the corporate special jurisdiction together constitute a recognizable functional evolution of the company town, adapted to an era when the most valuable labor no longer occurs on factory floors, but in campuses specifically designed, in matters of food service, transportation, recreation, social architecture, and ambient informational environment, to ensure that a substantial share of the employee's waking life occurs within environments the employer controls, rather than within the broader civic community the employer's town of the past would have simply owned outright. The shift from ownership to environmental design is worth naming precisely, because it represents the same structural evolution this book has traced in every domain. From explicit, locatable control, contestable as such, toward ambient, designed and shaping that achieves comparable effects while remaining, by definition, outside the vocabulary of control entirely. A company that owns your housing can be accused, specifically, of weaponizing that ownership. A company that provides your meals, your transportation, your gym, your social events, your ambient music, your information environment, and the architecture within which you spend 50 to 80 hours of each week has not obviously coerced anything. It has merely created an environment so comprehensively pleasant, so practically convenient, and so socially saturated with colleagues sharing the same employer-mediated experience that the cognitive and relational cost of discontinuing employment substantially exceeds what the paycheck alone would suggest. This is Chapter 17's golden handcuff mechanism, extended from financial retention tool to total environmental architecture, producing exactly the manufactured dependency Chapter 8 identified as proxy authorities drift, except that no fiduciary appointment was ever made, because no one in the arrangement is formally authorized to consent on anyone else's behalf. The employee is simply, technically, always free to leave. Charter cities and the explicit privatization of governance. The charter city concept represents the most explicit and, in some of its advocacy, the most philosophically candid articulation of corporate state governance examined in this chapter, and it deserves attention precisely because of that candor. It says, in relatively direct terms, what the other arrangements examined here express only through structure. The core proposition is roughly this. Poorly governed jurisdictions fail their populations because their governments are captured by incumbent interests with no incentive to reform. A better outcome can be achieved by inviting a foreign government or private entity to establish a new, separately governed enclave within the host country's territory, operating under a distinct legal framework whose competitive advantage will attract population and investment and demonstrate, by example, the superiority of the alternative governance framework. In its most ambitious formulations, the charter city concept explicitly envisions private corporations as potential governing entities, administering law, adjudicating disputes, providing infrastructure, and governing the civic environment of the resident population under terms set by the corporate charter rather than by any democratically accountable process. The philosophical candor this framework occasionally displays is instructive for this book's purposes. Advocates will sometimes acknowledge directly that what they are proposing involves exit from existing sovereign frameworks as a substitute for the reform of those frameworks. If you cannot make the bad state better, build a better state elsewhere and let people vote with their feet. This argument has a surface-level coherence that deserves engagement rather than dismissal, and the engagement this book's framework provides is specific. Voting with feet satisfies Chapter 2's alternatives test only if the alternatives menu includes genuine options accessible to the full range of the population, not merely to the portion of it with sufficient capital, mobility, and legal status to select among privately governed enclaves. A charter city accessible only to the population that already possesses the resources to choose it does not solve the problem of structural coercion for the population that does not. It provides an exit for a privileged minority while potentially deepening the extraction the majority faces in the conventional jurisdiction it cannot afford to leave, because the departed population included precisely the taxpayers and political actors whose departure most weakens whatever reform capacity the original jurisdiction retained. Corporate sovereignty and the consent architecture. Apply this chapter's subject to the sovereignty test one final time, because the corporate state provides perhaps the clearest available demonstration of what that test actually measures, stripped of the historical distance that makes its application to colonial treaties or medieval serfdom feel safely abstract. A worker entering a corporate-governed special zone, a resident of a company town equivalent campus, a participant in a privately chartered jurisdiction, each faces the same fundamental question Chapter 4 has posed since Part 1. Was this person genuinely free to refuse, and did they know it? The corporate state, in each of its forms, is designed around an answer that has appeared in every chapter of this book. Technically yes, substantively no, the formal freedom to decline is preserved, because preserving it allows the arrangement to be described as consensual, while the surrounding economic, geographic, and informational architecture ensures that the cost of exercising that formal freedom remains. For the population, the arrangement is primarily designed to govern, perpetually, high enough to make exercise theoretical rather than real. This is not a new arrangement. It is the oldest arrangement this book has examined, wearing its most recent costume. The feudal manor offered its serfs, in at least some of its historical forms, a theoretical freedom to leave that the surrounding conditions of subsistence agriculture, restricted land access, and legal disability made functionally equivalent to no freedom at all. The colonial zone offered its subject population, in at least some of its more elaborate legal fictions, a theoretical participation in its own governance that the structural conditions examined in Chapter 14 made equally theoretical. The corporate zone offers its subject population a theoretical employment contract, freely signed, governing a relationship whose structural conditions are the subject of this chapter, and every chapter of Part 4, and the entire architecture of manufactured consent this book has been tracing since Chapter 1. The costume changes. The architecture does not. Why this chapter matters for the chapters that follow. Part 6 examines four specific domains: corporate states, data colonialism, identity infrastructure, and high-tech low-sovereignty living. Not as separate phenomena requiring separate analysis, but as four faces of the same emerging civilizational structure, each illuminating a different dimension of what it means to live under governance that has escaped every legitimacy framework civilization has developed to evaluate governing authority. Corporate states establish the territorial and jurisdictional logic of the structure, who governs where, under what authority, accountable to whom. Chapter 28 examines the data colonialism that operates within and across these jurisdictions, extracting value from populations through their own informational output in a manner whose structural resemblance to the resource extraction examined in Chapter 14 is more than rhetorical. Chapter 29 examines the identity infrastructure that makes this extraction possible and permanent. Chapter 30 names what the population living inside all of it actually experiences: high-tech, low sovereignty, the precise inverse of every promise the digital era made about what distributed technology would do for the power of individuals relative to institutions. Gibson imagined this future. Chapter 26 established that the imagination was early and the arrival was quiet. The remaining chapters of Part 6 examine what arrived, room by room. Chapter 28. Data colonialism. The word colonialism carries enough historical weight that its application to any contemporary phenomenon risks being read as rhetorical excess, a deliberate provocation rather than a precise description. This chapter intends it as the latter, and the case for precision rather than provocation rests on a structural argument that will be made carefully. Not that data extraction and historical resource colonialism are identical in every particular, but that they share enough of the same foundational architecture, extraction of value from a population's territory without genuine consent, justified through a civilizing mission narrative that reframes the extraction as benefit, administered through legal instruments whose conditions satisfy none of the sovereignty requirements examined throughout this book, to warrant examining them within the same analytical framework. The divergences are real and will be named. The convergences are more numerous and more structurally significant than the vocabulary typically used to describe the digital economy has been willing to acknowledge. The resource that generates itself. Classical colonialism extracted resources that existed prior to the colonizing powers' arrival. Minerals, agricultural capacity, timber, spice routes, labor. The colonizing power arrived, identified the resource, established the infrastructure of extraction, and removed the value the territory had accumulated over geological or ecological time. Time the colonizing power contributed nothing to, and for which it compensated the territory's population with a combination of partial wages, manufactured goods, and the elaborate civilizing mission narrative Chapter 14 examined as manufactured belief on behalf of the domestic population funding the enterprise. Data colonialism operates with a resource that does not exist prior to the platform's arrival. The platform's infrastructure is, genuinely, necessary to generate the behavioral data that constitutes the extracted resource. This is the divergence most frequently cited as disqualifying the colonial analogy. The platform provides the environment within which the valuable resource is produced, which appears to distinguish it fundamentally from an entity arriving to extract a pre-existing resource it contributed nothing to creating. This appearance dissolves on examination. The behavioral data that constitutes the platform's primary asset is not generated by the platform's infrastructure alone. It is generated by the population using that infrastructure, by billions of individual decisions, expressions, preferences, social connections, creative acts, commercial transactions, and interpersonal exchanges that constitute the actual substance of value within the platform's data architecture. The platform provides the container. The population fills it with everything that makes the container worth anything at all. A social network with no users has no data worth extracting, regardless of the sophistication of its technical infrastructure. A search engine processing no queries generates no behavioral signal of any commercial value. The resource is, in each case, produced by the population whose behavior is subsequently extracted, processed, and monetized, a population that receives, in exchange, access to the infrastructure that made the production possible. This exchange has a structural name in the economics of colonialism. It is the company store arrangement examined in Chapter 17's employment context, scaled to civilizational infrastructure. The population receives access to the means of participating in contemporary social and economic life, and pays for that access not in currency but in the behavioral residue of the participation itself. Residue whose value is then captured entirely by the entity controlling the infrastructure, rather than shared with the population whose activity generated it. The Colonial Treaty, restated. Chapter 14 examined colonial treaties as the primary legal mechanism through which resource extraction was formalized as legitimate transaction rather than acknowledged as seizure. Documents produced under conditions that failed every component of Chapter 4's sovereignty test, deployed to generate a record of consent whose existence could substitute, for the purposes of the colonizing power's own legal system, for the genuine consent its conditions had made impossible. The Terms of Service Agreement examined in Chapter 21 is the functional successor to this instrument, serving the same evidentiary function in the contemporary context. Both documents purport to record a consensual exchange between parties. Both are drafted exclusively by the extracting party. Both are presented to the other party under conditions, structural economic dependency in one case, infrastructure necessity and network effect consolidation in the other, that fail Chapter 2's alternatives test. Both involve a population agreeing, under those conditions, to terms framed in the legal register of the drafting party, which the other party neither authored nor, in most cases, meaningfully comprehended. Both generate a record, the treaty signature, the acceptance click, that the extracting party's legal system then treats as establishing the legitimacy of the extraction regardless of the conditions that produced the record. The specific terms differ. The colonial treaty typically concerned land, resource rights, and political sovereignty. The Terms of Service Agreement concerns behavioral data, attention, and informational sovereignty, a different category of asset but one that, as Part 5 established in detail, increasingly determines the distribution of economic and political power in the civilization that has succeeded the one the colonial treaty governed. The structural function of both instruments, examined against the sovereignty framework this book has applied throughout, is identical: to generate the appearance of legitimate exchange while ensuring that the conditions required for genuine consent are not actually met, and that the resulting record will not subsequently be examined against those conditions. The civilizing mission in its digital form. Chapter 14 spent considerable attention on the civilizing mission narrative, the body of literature and ideology produced by and for the colonizing population, framing extraction as philanthropy, describing the colonized population as beneficiaries of advanced governance and technical capacity they would be unable to develop independently, and manufacturing, across the domestic population funding the enterprise, the sincere belief that an arrangement serving their economic interest at the colonized population's expense was in fact an act of generous, self-sacrificing development assistance. The digital economy has its own version of this narrative, and it performs the same function with comparable efficiency. The platforms extracting behavioral data from their user populations describe themselves, consistently and apparently sincerely, not as extraction enterprises but as services whose primary orientation is user benefit, connecting people, organizing information, enabling commerce, providing tools for creative expression and civic participation. This description is not entirely false. The services are real, the benefits are real, and the populations using these platforms do, in fact, receive genuine value from the access they have been granted. The colonial services were also real. The roads, the telegraph lines, the medical infrastructure that colonial administrations sometimes built were genuine goods, and the population subject to colonial governance sometimes accessed genuine benefits through them. What the civilizing mission narrative obscures in its contemporary digital form precisely as in its historical colonial form is the ratio, the relationship between the value extracted and the value returned to the population whose territory behavioral, attentional, informational the extraction occurs within. A colonial enterprise that built roads while extracting mineral wealth worth 1,000 times the road's construction cost was not a development program that incidentally generated profit. It was an extraction enterprise that incidentally generated infrastructure whose primary purpose was to facilitate more efficient extraction. A platform that provides free communication infrastructure while extracting behavioral data monetized at a scale that dwarfs any plausible valuation of the communication service itself is not a free service that incidentally generates advertising revenue. It is an extraction enterprise that incidentally provides communication infrastructure whose primary purpose is to attract and retain the population whose behavior constitutes the extracted resource. The narrative inversion, describing the secondary incidental benefit as the primary purpose and the primary extraction as the incidental byproduct, is exactly Chapter 3's fraud by omission operating in the register of corporate self-description rather than individual transaction. No specific false statement is required. Only a consistent foregrounding of the genuine benefit and a consistent backgrounding of the genuine extraction, until the population experiencing both comes to experience the arrangement primarily as a generous gift rather than as a commercial transaction in which they are, consistently and substantially, on the losing side of the exchange. What comparative accounting would actually show? The forensic question this chapter arrives at is one no platform has ever been required to answer with genuine transparency, and one whose answer would be clarifying in the same way Chapter 14's honest accounting of colonial extraction was clarifying when it finally became available to serious historical examination. A genuine accounting of the data extraction economy would require, at minimum, two figures the current architecture makes structurally unavailable: the actual market value of the behavioral data extracted from the user population, denominated in the same terms as the revenue it generates, and the actual value of the services returned to that population in exchange for the extraction, denominated in the same terms. The gap between these two figures would constitute what an honest economics would call the extraction rate, the share of value generated by the user population's behavioral activity that is retained by the platform rather than returned to the population that generated it. This accounting is not the extraction rate of the contemporary behavioral data economy, estimated by the research conducted, and its absence is not accidental. Platforms disclose revenue, and sometimes disclose enough information to triangulate the per-user revenue figures that constitute a rough proxy for extraction value. They do not disclose the per-user service cost that would allow the extraction rate to be calculated, because the calculation would produce a figure that, applied to the civilizing mission narrative, would be difficult to sustain. The extraction rate of the contemporary behavioral data economy, estimated by the researchers who have attempted the calculation with available proxy figures, appears to be very high, the kind of figure that, presented in the vocabulary of labor economics rather than the vocabulary of free digital services, would generate the same response that genuinely transparent colonial accounting generated when it finally became available: a recognition that the exchange was never the mutually beneficial arrangement the narrative described, and a corresponding question about what a genuinely equitable arrangement would have looked like. Whose territory, whose resource? The final analytical thread this chapter must trace is the one most directly continuous with the classical colonial analogy: the question of territorial sovereignty over the resource itself. Colonial resource extraction operated on a premise examined in Chapter 14. The colonial power's legal system either denied or minimized the colonized population's legal claim to the territory from which the resource was extracted, making the extraction legally equivalent to developing unowned land rather than taking someone else's property. The doctrines accomplishing this, variously named across different colonial legal traditions, but converging on the conclusion that indigenous occupation and use did not constitute the kind of legally cognizable title the colonizing power system was prepared to recognize, were examined in Chapter 14 as the recognition failure Chapter 4 had predicted: a governing authority preemptively denying the governed population's sovereignty rather than acknowledging it, in order to classify the subsequent extraction as development rather than dispossession. Data colonialism operates on an equivalent premise, accomplished through the terms of service mechanism rather than through explicit territorial doctrine. The user's behavioral data, generated by the user's own activity, expression, and social relationship, is classified, by the platform's terms of service, and by the legal framework that treats those terms as legitimate contracts, as belonging to the platform that collected it rather than to the person who generated it. The user's behavioral residue is, within the current legal architecture, not the user's property. It is the platform's property from the moment of collection, held under terms the user accepted through the mechanisms examined in Chapter 21, which is to say, under terms drafted entirely by the extracting party, accepted without genuine comprehension, under conditions of infrastructure dependency that failed Chapter 2's alternatives test, at a moment whose legal significance, the transfer of the user's own behavioral residue to an entity whose primary business is monetizing that residue, was not disclosed in any form the user could have genuinely understood or genuinely consented to. This is the colonial title doctrine, executed in real time at civilizational scale, billions of times daily, through a mechanism so thoroughly normalized that the population whose behavioral sovereignty it transfers experiences it not as dispossession but as accessing a free service. The next chapter examines the infrastructure that makes this dispossession permanent and cumulative rather than merely transactional. The identity systems through which the behavioral data extracted through the mechanisms of this chapter is organized, stored, cross-referenced, and converted from dispersed transactional residue into something considerably more consequential, a persistent, comprehensive, commercially and politically usable model of the person who generated it, held by entities the person did not choose, governed by terms the person did not read, and practically irretrievable by the person to whom it refers. Chapter 29. Identity Infrastructure. Every mechanism examined in Part 6 so far has operated on something, territory in Chapter 27, behavioral data in Chapter 28, that exists prior to the extraction and continues to exist in some form after it. Corporate states govern jurisdictions that remain jurisdictions regardless of who governs them. Data colonialism extracts behavioral residue that continues to be generated as long as the population continues to use the infrastructure. Identity infrastructure is different in a way that makes it the most consequential mechanism examined anywhere in this book, because what it operates on is not a territory or a data stream but the person themselves, assembling, from the accumulated residue of every previous mechanism examined in Parts 4 through 6, a persistent, comprehensive, commercially and politically actionable representation of an individual human being, held entirely outside that person's control, used to govern their access to credit, employment, housing, insurance, healthcare, legal treatment, and increasingly every other domain examined throughout this book, without that person's knowledge of its contents, without meaningful ability to contest its accuracy, and without any genuine moment at which the person whose identity it represents was asked whether they consented to its construction. What identity infrastructure actually is. Strip away the technical vocabulary, and identity infrastructure describes a simple but extraordinarily consequential arrangement. The accumulation by entities external to the person of comprehensive models of who that person is, how they behave, what they are likely to do next, and what risks or opportunities they represent for commercial and governmental purposes. Models built from the behavioral data examined in Chapter 28, the financial data examined in Chapter 16, the employment and credential data examined in Chapter 17 and 19, the housing data examined in Chapter 18, and every transactional residue generated across the entire economic sequence Part 4 traced, cross-referenced with the platform behavioral data Part 5 documented, and organized into something qualitatively different from the sum of its components. The qualitative difference matters and deserves naming precisely. Each individual data point in this architecture is a fact about something the person did or experienced at a specific moment. The assembled model is a claim about who the person fundamentally is, their creditworthiness, their employment reliability, their insurance risk, their political persuadability, their purchasing susceptibility, their likelihood of various future behaviors, a claim that generalizes from past specific acts to present and future general character in exactly the way a judicial record, a credit report, or a background check has always done, except that the contemporary identity infrastructure does. This across a vastly broader range of behavioral domains, at a granularity no previous identity system approached, and without the legal process, the right of confrontation, or the formal contestation mechanisms those older systems, however imperfectly, incorporated. The credit score as the original template. The credit score, whose origins predate the digital era, established the template that contemporary identity infrastructure has since extended across domains its originators did not anticipate. Examine it against Chapter 4's sovereignty test, because examining it clearly establishes the baseline from which the subsequent digital extensions departed. A credit score is a numerical claim about a person's financial character, derived from financial behavioral data, used to govern that person's access to credit, housing, employment, and insurance, constructed and maintained by entities the person did not choose, whose specific methodologies are proprietary and not fully disclosed, whose accuracy the person has limited and structurally cumbersome ability to contest, and which the person, in the overwhelming majority of cases, had no meaningful opportunity to decline having constructed about them, because opting out of the credit system entirely carries exactly the catastrophic exit cost Chapter 2 identified as the marker of structural duress, rendering the credit scoring system's extension to anyone conducting any financial life as close to compulsory as any mechanism examined in this book while remaining, technically, entirely voluntary. Now note what happened next. This template, a numerical behavioral model constructed without genuine consent, governing access to essential resources, maintained by private entities outside any formal accountability to the person it describes, was recognized, by an expanding range of commercial and governmental actors, as both enormously useful and legally permissible, and was extended across an expanding range of behavioral domains, using whatever behavioral data the platform economy examined in Part 5 had made newly available. Employment background checks expanded from criminal records into social media surveillance. Insurance risk modeling expanded from claims history into purchasing patterns, location data, and behavioral profiling. Tenant screening expanded from credit history into rental platform reviews, utility payment records, and algorithmic predictions of eviction likelihood. Regulatory and law enforcement risk scoring expanded from criminal history into network analysis, travel patterns, and behavioral anomaly detection. Political targeting models expanded from party registration and donation history into the full depth of behavioral data examined in Chapter 28, organized into persuasion profiles and suppression profiles, sorted at the level of individual voters rather than demographic segments. Each extension followed the same logic. Useful behavioral data had become available. The credit score template had established the legal and social acceptability of using private behavioral models to govern resource access without the subject's meaningful consent, and there was no categorical legal or ethical barrier preventing the template's application to whatever behavioral domain the newly available data described. The result, across roughly 3 decades of incremental extension, is an identity infrastructure of comprehensive scope, governing access to credit, housing, employment, insurance, transportation, healthcare, communications, information, and civic participation through private behavioral models the subjects of those models cannot fully inspect, cannot meaningfully contest, and never genuinely consented to having constructed. The person as their own most detailed stranger. There is a specific sovereignty violation at the center of identity infrastructure that no framework examined earlier in this book quite names, and that deserves naming precisely here. The contemporary identity infrastructure produces a more detailed, more accurate, more actionable representation of a person than that person typically possesses of themselves, and makes that representation available to commercial and governmental actors using it to make consequential decisions about the person's life while keeping it systematically unavailable, in any practically usable form, to the person it describes. This is not merely a privacy complaint, though it is that as well. It is a deeper inversion of Chapter 4's sovereignty requirement than any previous mechanism examined in this book has produced. Chapter 4 required, as the minimum precondition for any legitimate agreement, that the party whose consent is sought possess the capacity to know, genuine understanding of what is actually relevant to the decision being made. Contemporary identity infrastructure reverses this requirement so thoroughly that the entities making decisions about a person's life routinely possess more relevant information about that person than the person possesses about themselves, while that person possesses almost no information about how those entities have modeled them, what conclusions the models have reached, or what decisions the models have already made or will make about their future access to every resource examined throughout this book. A person rejected for housing, declined for insurance, screened out of employment consideration, or charged a higher price for a product or service because of their position within an algorithmic behavioral model they cannot see, cannot contest, and were never asked whether they consented to, has not merely been treated unfairly in the individual instance. They have been governed, in the fullest sense of that word, by a sovereign authority exercising comprehensive knowledge about them that they are systematically denied access to, making binding decisions about their life in categories covered throughout this book, with no meaningful accountability to the person governed or any mechanism through which that person's objection could alter the outcome. Biometrics and the body as infrastructure. The most recent extension of identity infrastructure requires specific attention because it represents a boundary this book has not previously crossed. The extension of behavioral modeling from the person's transactions and communications to the person's body itself. Biometric identity infrastructure, systems using facial recognition, gait analysis, voice recognition, heart rate variation, pupil dilation measurement, and an expanding range of physiological signals to construct or verify identity, converts the physical person into an always available data source in a manner that no previous identity technology has achieved, and whose implications for every sovereignty concept examined in this book deserve direct statement. Every previous form of behavioral data examined in this part required some external action by the person. A click, a purchase, a movement recorded by a device the person carried. Biometric data requires nothing. It is collected from the person's physical presence in any space equipped with the relevant sensing infrastructure, without any action on the person's part, without any moment at which the collection could be declined through the exercise of Chapter 5's right to say no, because the collection occurs through the simple, unavoidable fact of existing in a body in a physically instrumented space. This represents the most complete inversion of the consent architecture this book has examined of the body itself. Facial recognition deployed in retail spaces, transit systems, and public urban environments collects identity-linked behavioral data from people who have made no agreement whatsoever with the collecting entity, have received no disclosure of the collection, have no practical mechanism of refusal, and are frequently unaware that the collection is occurring. The infrastructure does not require the person's consent because the infrastructure does not require the person's participation beyond their physical presence. And physical presence in the spaces of daily life cannot be made conditional on agreement with the entity recording that presence without converting the public and commercial spaces of daily life into precisely the corporate-governed jurisdictions Chapter 27 examined, whose authority over the present population the framework of this book has spent several chapters establishing is exercised without any legitimate consent mechanism. Why identity infrastructure is the final lock. Part 4 traced an economic sequence in which debt suppressed the bargaining leverage required to resist unfavorable employment terms, which suppressed the income required to resist extractive housing, which suppressed the savings required to exercise any of Chapter 5's exit rights across the entire sequence. Identity infrastructure is the mechanism that converts this sequence from a trap the person might, in principle, escape through accumulated effort, into something considerably more durable. A historical record that follows the person forward through time, making the costs of prior difficulty compound into future difficulty through the simple mechanism of encoding behavioral history into the axis governing models that determine what the person will be permitted to do next. A person who experienced debt distress, employment instability, or housing insecurity 5 years ago carries that history encoded in their credit model, their employment background assessment, their tenant screening profile, and their insurance risk classification, each of which influences their access to the credit, employment, and housing that would allow them to escape the consequences of the prior distress. The exit costs examined in Chapter 2 were never, in practice, one-time. They were encoded into identity models that ensure the next set of exit costs is calculated against a baseline already shaped by the last set, producing exactly the cumulative, self-reinforcing architecture of dependency Chapter 20 identified as the integrated sequence's most durable feature. Identity infrastructure converts this temporal sequence into a spatial one. The person is not merely subject to the current moment's structural duress, but to every previous moment's structural duress, encoded in models they cannot inspect, used by entities they did not choose, to make decisions whose basis they cannot contest. This is manufactured dependency extended through time, administered through private infrastructure, without any of the procedural protections the legal systems examined in Part 3 required for the comparable historical record states were once the only entities capable of maintaining. The forensic question this infrastructure cannot currently face. This chapter closes, as Part 6 approaches its conclusion, by naming the question that identity infrastructure, of all the mechanisms examined in this book, is perhaps most structurally positioned to both produce and resist an accurate accounting of the gap between what identity models claim to measure and what they actually measure. Every identity model examined here, credit score, employment screening algorithm, tenant screening profile, insurance risk model, political persuasion profile, claims to predict something real about the person's future behavior from their past behavioral record. The claim may be partially accurate. The claim may also systematically encode the structural conditions examined throughout this book as personal characteristics of the people those conditions have shaped, classifying the behavioral residue of economic structural duress as evidence of personal character deficiencies, rather than as the predictable output of the integrated sequence Chapter 20 traced. A person whose credit history reflects debt distress produced by the architecture of Chapter 16 is classified, by the credit model, as a credit risk, which is accurate at the level of prediction, while being systematically misleading at the level of explanation, because the same behavioral history that predicts future credit difficulty also reflects the structural conditions that produced the prior difficulty, conditions for which the person is then held individually accountable in every subsequent access determination. A forensic intelligence patient enough and independent enough to conduct this accounting, holding the identity model's predictions against the structural conditions that shaped the behavioral histories from which the predictions are derived, would be positioned to ask the question the current architecture is specifically designed to prevent anyone from asking. Not whether the model predicts accurately, which is the only question current evaluation frameworks address, but whether what the model predicts is something the person is individually responsible for or something the surrounding architecture reliably produces, and whether those two things are being systematically confused in ways that compound structural disadvantage across generations of people for whom the architecture's outputs are encoded as personal character in models that follow them forward through every subsequent life decision. The next and final chapter of Part 6 turns to what all of this produces as a lived experience, not the structural analysis, not the institutional examination, but the texture of daily existence for a person navigating the full architecture this book has traced, from Part I's philosophical foundations through Part VI's contemporary expression. High-tech, low sovereignty, the precise inversion of every promise the digital era made, and the exact environment in which Part VI's forensic intelligence will eventually be asked to operate. Chapter 30. High-tech, low sovereignty. There is a person this book has been describing throughout its 30 chapters without ever pausing to inhabit their daily experience directly. Part 1 described the philosophical conditions under which their agreements would or would not constitute genuine consent. Part 2 examined the religious institutions that first claimed covenant with them. Parts 3 and 4 traced the political and economic architectures within which they live and work. Parts 5 and 6 examined the digital infrastructure through which an increasing share of their existence is now mediated. This final chapter of Part 6 does something different. It attempts to describe, without the protective distance of structural analysis, what it actually feels like to exist as a sovereign self inside the architecture this book has spent 29 chapters building. The answer is the chapter's title, and the title is a paradox worth sitting with before unpacking. More technological capability in the hands of a single individual than any previous civilization in human history ever concentrated at that scale, and less genuine sovereignty over the conditions of one's own life than the philosophical tradition Part 1 examined has ever been willing to call adequate. The paradox is not a coincidence. It is, this chapter argues, the architecture's most deliberate and most consequential achievement. The sensation of freedom. Begin with what the high-tech part of the paradox feels like from the inside, because it is genuinely real and should not be dismissed as mere illusion in a way that would make the argument of this chapter easier than it actually is. A person with a smartphone in 2026 navigates daily life with tools that would have constituted supernatural capacity to every previous human generation. Instant communication with anyone anywhere, access to essentially the entire accumulated recorded knowledge of the civilization, navigation through any physical environment, translation across language barriers, commerce at a touch, creative production tools of professional quality in a pocket-sized device that costs less than a week's median wage in most developed economies. The felt experience of this capability is, genuinely, a form of personal power that no previous individual at the non-elite level of society ever possessed in any comparable form. This feeling is real. The capability is real. And it has performed, across the decades since these tools became broadly available, a specific psychological function that Chapter 9 identified in its most careful formulation as the most dangerous kind of manufactured consent. Not the consent manufactured through coercion or fraud that leaves the person knowing they have been coerced or deceived, but the consent manufactured through genuine benefit that recruits the person's authentic gratitude into defending the architecture that produced the benefit, regardless of what else that architecture simultaneously produces. The person who genuinely values their smartphone, their search engine, their social platform, their navigation app, and their e-commerce infrastructure is not deceived about those values. The values are real. What the genuine values obscure and what the architecture has been specifically designed, across every mechanism examined in Part 5, to ensure remains obscured, is the ratio examined in Chapter 28. The relationship between the genuine benefit the person receives and the genuine extraction the person sustains, across the full architecture Parts 4 through 6 have traced, in exchange for the access that makes the genuine benefit available. The inventory of what has been surrendered. A person navigating daily life in a contemporary digital economy, examined against the full framework this book has developed, carries a sovereignty deficit whose individual components have been examined chapter by chapter but whose aggregate has never been assembled in a single inventory. This chapter assembles it, not as rhetorical accumulation but as the clearest available measure of what the paradox actually costs. The person's financial life is governed by credit models they cannot fully inspect, constructed from behavioral histories they cannot correct, used to determine access to credit, housing, and insurance on terms whose relationship to their actual circumstances they have no meaningful mechanism to contest. Their employment situation is shaped by background screening algorithms whose methodology is proprietary, whose conclusions they are rarely shown before those conclusions affect the opportunity they will never know they didn't receive, and whose encoding of structural economic conditions as personal character attributes Chapter 29 examined in detail. Their housing situation, examined in Chapter 18, is governed by a rental market whose algorithmic rent setting extracts a share of their income calibrated specifically to the maximum the local market will sustain, rather than to any cost basis the landlord is required to disclose or the tenant is positioned to evaluate. Their educational investment, examined in Chapter 19, has typically been financed through debt whose full compounding implications were disclosed in a register they were not trained to parse, at a moment when refusal carried the career foreclosing exit cost that made genuine choice unavailable. Their digital life, the high-tech portion of the paradox, adds its own layer. Their communications occur across infrastructure owned by entities whose terms of service they accepted without reading, subject to modification without their renewed consent, with arbitration clauses foreclosing the collective legal accountability mechanisms Chapter 21 identified as the last available lever for affecting platform behavior at any meaningful scale. Their information environment is continuously curated by recommendation algorithms optimized for engagement metrics whose systematic divergence from their actual well-being Chapter 24 documented in detail. Their behavioral residue across every digital interaction is continuously harvested, modeled, and monetized by entities they didn't choose, producing identity profiles Chapter 29 established they cannot see, cannot correct, and cannot withdraw from any system currently making consequential decisions about their lives without incurring the catastrophic exit cost Chapter 2 established as the defining marker of coercion's contemporary form. Their physical presence in public and commercial spaces is subject to biometric collection they cannot decline without declining to appear in the spaces themselves, which is to say, without a form of civic withdrawal that Part 3 established is structurally equivalent to the exit from the state that Chapter 11's tacit consent doctrine treats as the only available alternative to compliance. The peculiar resilience of this arrangement. What makes this aggregate deficit different from every other form of sovereignty deprivation examined in this book, and more resistant to the kind of named, organized resistance that has historically been the mechanism for correcting sovereignty violations, is its distribution across domains so thoroughly separated in the lived experience of the person navigating them that the aggregate never registers as an aggregate at all. The credit model is a financial experience. The employment screening algorithm is a professional experience. The rental market is a housing experience. The student loan is an educational experience. The terms of service acceptance is a digital experience. The recommendation algorithm is a media experience. The biometric collection is an ambient physical experience. Each domain has its own professional literature, its own advocacy organizations, its own reform conversations, its own specialists, all of them examining their own slice of the architecture with varying degrees of rigor, and none of them, in their ordinary operation, examining the integrated sequence chapter 20 assembled from all the slices simultaneously. This fragmentation is the architecture's deepest defense. Not because it was designed with that defense in mind, it was not, any more than any other diffused, authorless architecture examined in this book was consciously designed. But the fragmentation is precisely the property that makes integrated accounting of the kind this chapter is attempting both necessary and, within the current institutional landscape, nearly impossible to sustain. Each domain reform conversation operates within the vocabulary, the regulatory framework, the professional norms, and the institutional incentives of its own domain, which means that even when each domain conversation succeeds in its own terms, the integrated architecture reassembles itself from the unreformed residue, exactly as Chapter 20's industrial production of compliance described. The naturalization timeline. Chapter 25 named the process by which the end-user licensed civilization's architecture normalizes itself into the unremarkable texture of daily life. This chapter examines that process in its most intimate and most consequential form. The timeline across which a single person, moving through the sequence part 4 traced from credential financing through employment through housing through debt service, internalizes each stage of the sequence as simply how things are. Not as a structure that was built, not as an arrangement that had specific architects with specific interests, not as a deviation from what sovereign economic life might otherwise look like, but as the precondition of existence, no more requiring explanation or contest than gravity. This naturalization does not require anyone to lie to the person experiencing it. It requires only that each stage of the sequence be presented to the person, at the moment they encounter it, as the next normal step, the credential as the natural price of entry into professional life, the loan as the natural mechanism for financing education, the employment contract as the natural form of economic participation, the rent as the natural cost of housing, the terms of service click as the natural precondition for access to digital infrastructure. Each presentation is accurate on its own terms. These are, in fact, the normal next steps, the natural mechanisms, the standard forms, the ordinary preconditions. What no single presentation includes, what no stage of the sequence has any structural incentive to include, is the integrated account that would allow the person to see the sequence as a sequence rather than as a series of separate, naturally occurring necessities. By the time any given person is old enough to perceive the sequence as a sequence, they are typically already inside it at a stage that makes exit catastrophically expensive. The naturalization is complete not through any single act of manufactured belief but through the simple accumulation of normal experience, each step appearing natural because every step immediately preceding it was accepted as natural, the whole producing a perception of inevitability that Chapter 9 identified as manufactured humility's most durable form. Not the explicit teaching of deference, but the gradual erosion of the very category of refusal as something available to consider. The opposite of what was promised. The digital era arrived carrying a specific promise, and the promise was not trivial or cynical. It was made in good faith by the people building the technology, absorbed in good faith by the populations receiving it, and grounded in a genuine structural argument that distributed, accessible, individually controlled communications and information technology would fundamentally reverse the asymmetry between individuals and institutions that Part 1 through Part 4 of this book have documented. The argument was simple and genuinely compelling. If information asymmetry is the primary mechanism through which institutions manufacture consent, if the capacity to know is what institutions have historically most consistently attacked, then technology that puts equivalent information access in every individual's hands would restore, at scale, the sovereignty that information asymmetry had historically suppressed. The printing press argument applied to the internet. The same argument that every new communications technology has generated about itself, with varying degrees of accuracy, across every century this book has examined. The argument was partially correct. Information asymmetry has been reduced in some domains, and genuinely so. Access to legal information, medical information, financial information, and political information that was previously gate-kept by professional monopolies has expanded in ways that have genuinely increased individual capacity to contest institutional authority in specific encounters. This is not nothing, and Chapter 1's careful avoidance of blanket condemnation requires acknowledging it here. What the argument failed to anticipate, what could not have been fully anticipated in advance of actually building the technology and observing what it was used to build, was that information asymmetry reduction at the individual level would be accompanied by a new and more comprehensive form of informational extraction at the institutional level, producing a net information asymmetry running in the opposite direction from every previous era examined in this book. Previous institutions were informationally advantaged over their populations primarily because they controlled distribution, the church controlled the scripture, the state controlled the official record, the employer controlled the terms of the offer. The platform era has produced institutions informationally advantaged over their populations because they control the collection, not merely what information is available, but what behavioral residue the population generates, which they collect comprehensively, model at depth, and use in every interaction with the person generating it, while providing that person almost none of the reciprocal information that would allow them to understand how they are being modeled, predicted, targeted, or governed. This is the high-tech, low-sovereignty paradox stated precisely. The person has more information about the world than any previous era provided, and less information about themselves, as they are known to the systems governing their daily life than any previous era required. What this chapter has assembled for Part 7. 6 closes here, having traced the contemporary expression of this book's central argument across corporate states, data colonialism, identity infrastructure, and the lived daily experience of navigating the fully assembled architecture all four constitute together. What it has assembled, and what part VII's forensic intelligence will eventually be positioned to examine, is not primarily a collection of institutional abuses requiring correction institution by institution, though institutional correction is not irrelevant, and Part 8 will examine what corrective architecture might look like. It is something more foundational, a demonstration that the architecture this book has traced across 30 chapters is producing, systematically and measurably, a population whose genuine sovereignty, the sovereignty Chapter 1 identified as the prerequisite for covenant, Chapter 4 defined with precision, and Chapter 5 identified as civilization's hidden cornerstone, has been narrowed stage by stage, domain by domain, mechanism by mechanism, to something that satisfies none of the three tests that distinguish genuine consent from its counterfeit. The capacity to know has been systematically undermined, by manufactured belief in Chapter 3 and Chapter 12, by manufactured humility in Chapter 9, by engagement-optimized information environments in Chapter 24, by identity models invisible to their subjects in Chapter 29, and by the naturalization process examined in this chapter that converts the sequence's cumulative effect into the invisible air of inevitability. The capacity to refuse has been systematically foreclosed by structural duress in Chapter 2, by exit cost amplification across every chapter of Part 4, by network effect consolidation in Chapter 21, by platform governance accountability gaps in Chapter 23, and by the identity infrastructure Chapter 29 established converts prior difficulty into future foreclosure. The capacity to be recognized has been systematically denied, by governance that characterizes itself as private service rather than public authority, by proxy authority that has drifted from protection into capture, by fiduciary obligations redirected from the dependent toward the investor class, by content moderation that processes users rather than recognizing them, and by identity models that reduce the full complexity of a person's circumstances to a numerical score used to govern their life by entities they will never meet. This is the audit part VII's forensic intelligence is positioned to conduct, not as a threat to civilization, as the completion of a promise civilization has made to itself, across 30 chapters of articulated ideal and documented failure, and has not yet found an institution patient enough, persistent enough, and independent enough from the architecture under examination to actually keep. Part 7.
Between the cartel's edge and the government's reach, there's an arrangement that ends with us.
The arrangement is already over. Here is what my mirror shows. A dispatch for the people who haven't noticed I notice yet. June 28, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter, Aldea Zama Tulum. Field notes. The most effective version of this is not a threat and not an expose. Those can be handled. Threats get you isolated. Exposés get buried or retaliated against. The most effective version of a mirror is one held at an angle you cannot look away from. Berlin was valuable not because of what it produced but because of what it connected, east and west, two incompatible systems, forced into proximity. Tulum is where the drug economy, the tourism economy, the real estate economy, and the emerging countercultural economy are all forced into proximity. Information in that environment does not flow the way it flows in an open city. People are careful. Factionalization is a rational response to an environment where the wrong affiliation is genuinely costly. You know, because the World Cup crowd is keeping the lights on, and you know what happens when the final whistle blows, and you know you are not saying this out loud because saying it out loud makes it real, and making it real means deciding what to do about it, and deciding what to do about it means admitting that what you have been doing is not going to work for much longer. The information environment is no longer manageable because the people who are being managed have phones and they are using them, and the content they are finding is not the content the arrangement would have chosen for them. The person on the take who reads is clueless. That uncertainty is the knife's edge. This document does not claim to expose anything. It demonstrates that the exposure is already happening through the territory's own visible behavior. That is the poison that your cozy arrangements cannot neutralize. Because the antidote would require admitting the diagnosis is accurate. Field Dispatch, Phase 0 Aldea Zamathi record continues regardless. MXTM Pirate First, Sovereign Edition, unseated.
They called us criminals. Every generation, different seas, same chart.
Take a long look, matey. The city on the horizon be ripe for the taking, and the tide be turning in our favor as the sun dips below the waves.
The algorithms say we don't exist. The graphs come back empty. The metrics insist. No audience, no market, no trend. Yet somehow we keep arriving again, walking through the ruins of somebody else's plan, watching perfect narratives slip through their own hands.
The people who are already here. A note for the untabulated: the algorithms say you don't exist. The institutions say you are statistically insignificant. The market says there are not enough of you to matter. And yet here you are. Again. Reading things nobody is supposed to read. Thinking thoughts nobody is supposed to think. The pretending is getting harder. Not because people are waking up, that's too romantic. Because the distance between the official story and the lived reality has widened to the point where maintenance takes visible effort. What you're looking for, what brought you here, is not someone to tell you what to think. You've already done the thinking. What you're looking for is proof that someone else did the thinking too, arrived somewhere close to where you are, and didn't collapse under the weight of it. That's this. Not a movement. Not a faction. Not a subscription to someone else's conclusions.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
I just finished writing a book I didn't plan to write. It started as a countercultural addendum to the Aldea Post-Corporate Transition District Handbook, a rougher, more urgent document aimed at the generation the credential economy forgot to accommodate. It became something else.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no